Hi, it's Richard White here again. Today's fly is a streamer. This I refer to as my gray bucktail ghost. So it's loosely based on a gray ghost, but using bucktail. It still uses, this similar body and similar colors, but in bucktail, which I find is often an easier material to work with and to get the proportions I like than working with hackle feathers. So, with no further ado, let's just jump right into tying the fly. So first of all, I'm starting with a Mustad R79, which is a 9XL long hook, very long hook shank. Unfortunately, they don't make these anymore. They're becoming more and more difficult to get. So I'm starting using white thread, because white thread will not affect the color of the floss we're going to use for the body. So I'm going to need some floss, and you need to take a fairly long section of the floss to cover the body. And you can use other colors. I rather like the yellow. Let me clip that off. Lay that floss on the body. Then I'm going to go down in, use the floss to guide the thread as I go down in touching or near touching turns. And since I'm using white thread, it's not going to affect the color the floss appears, especially when it gets wet. And long shank, so it takes a fair number of turns to work your way down the shank. A little bit quicker going back up, but we want to keep this body fairly as smooth as we can get it. So close to touching turns. They don't have to be perfectly touching. Now I'm going to get back to just around the hook point. I'm going to lay the floss down, get myself a piece of silver Mylar. And this is the same piece is going to be used for the tag and for the rib. So I'm going to lay it in with the gold side facing out, a few turns over that to hold it down. Then I'm going to bring the thread all the way back forward. You can spin it to flatten it out if you like. I don't find it makes a huge difference with this fly in terms of having a smooth body. That's mostly about your attention to detail laying down the floss. So do this as quickly as I can while still doing it well. And at this point I'm just looking to have a fairly smooth body with no gaps. So if there were any gaps from the first round through, I make sure I eliminate them now. And then I'm going to come up and leave a little room at the front. And I'm just going to put in a half hitch, well, two of them, so that my thread doesn't go anywhere while we wind. So now I'm going to bring the floss up and trying to keep it flat much as possible and keep it from spreading, and just touching slightly overlapping turns as we go forward. I'll do them slowly. I'm just letting it run through my fingers as smoothly as possible. I do not have lots of calluses on my fingers. If you do, this can be a little trickier because the floss can catch more. Now I'm just going to speed this up a little bit, since it's just more of the same. Wind and wind and wind and wind. Wind. Slow down every so often. But as long as the fibers are not spreading on you, you can go quite quickly. But every so often they'll get a little bit out of whack, and you'll have some that are moving, that want to spread out, and then it's hard to keep a smooth body, or at least a uniform body. So at this point I'm just talking as we, whoops, did I miss a spot there? Nope. That's the one problem with talking and trying to go too fast, is you can slip a little bit. So, and it takes a while to figure out how much floss you need to cut. I have a little more than I need here, but it's a real pain if you end up coming up short. So bring that in front. A few tight turns to bind that down, and I'll bring it back, come over it a few more times so it doesn't go anywhere. Now, whenever I'm cutting and I have basically my thread and something else, I always put a finger between them. That way I only cut what it is I want to cut. Now, back to the tail end of the fly. I'm going to take that tinsel, fold it over 2, 3, 4 turns going back. I'll go a 5th, and then I'm going to come back over those to create that nice smooth tag. Then winding it as I go forward, trying to hold a constant angle of the Mylar to the hook shank, and that'll give me a uniform distribution. I tend to make these turns a little tighter than some people. Some people would go for many fewer turns. I just prefer the look this way. Purely up to you which way you'd like to do it. And bring this up to the front. Once you have it held in, a few turns, and then I fold it back, and a few turns over that, so it's not going anywhere, and clip. Tail end in the trash. Alright, so, whoops, it actually has to make it to the trash. Tighten that up, and then I'm going to whip finish with the white. Clip off the white thread, switch to black thread, which is going to be the thread for the head. Things are sticking to my fingers today. I was working with glue earlier, that's going to happen. So now, turn it over so I can work on the underside. So for the belly, again, in keeping with a typical gray ghost style fly, I'm going to start with several strands of peacock herl. I think I've grabbed 5 here, and what I'm going to try to do is to get the tips pretty much aligned. They do not need to be perfect. And I generally make those just about the length of the hook shank, a tad longer. Lay that in on the underside of the shank. Bind them down. And I want them to sit fairly flat. Clip off any excess. And clean up a little bit. Easier to clean up as you go than to do everything at the end. So now some white bucktail. And you can see I have this one that's been picked over some. Now here I don't want it to flare much, so I'm going to take it from closer to the tip so that the hair has less of a tendency to flare. I don't need a lot. This particular bucktail has very nice long hairs on it, so I won't even need all of what's here. And these have, just a little bit of kink to them, which works for this fly. Excuse me while I clean this up. I'll lay this to be just a tad longer than the peacock herl. Now, some people would bind it and then cut it. I generally prefer to cut it to length first. I find it's easier to get a clean cut, and I don't have to deal with little ends that are in the way later on. Bring the thread back just a little bit. Lay it in place. And I'm laying it in place on the underside of the shank, but I'm rotating that toward me just so I can see better and make sure it stays purely on the underside of the shank. And I want it to sit fairly as flat as possible. I don't want it to flare. So the wrap's not too tight when they go a little further back, up further forward, quite tight to make sure everything stays bound in. But just a shade looser towards the rear, and that will keep that bucktail from flaring too much. All right, now, then what I need is one golden pheasant crest, and I want this to be roughly half the length of the body. It could be a little bit more, a little bit less. This is not an exact science. I'm going to lay this top. These can be a little finicky. They're almost never perfectly straight, so you generally have to compromise a little bit with these in terms of getting them in place where you want them. Bind it down in place, and that will finish us for the underside of the fly. And you can tug this down a little bit to give you a little bit more of a belly to it. All right, so the wing itself is going to be all bucktail. So I have two shades of bucktail here. First is a fairly pale bluish gray. Excuse me and this bucktail that I get from Musky Fool is really nice. It's very straight, very smooth, very fine, so it tends not to flare as much. So it's very nice for these type of slender streamers. All right, so I'll take my bundle, and I've got a couple of hairs that are out of play, but the rest of them fit. And I'm going to want this to be just a little bit longer than the hook shank. Measure that to where I want it. Again, I prefer to clip them. Excuse me while I do that over the trash. And then tie them in. Other people will tie them in and then cut them to fit. Whoops, that's running off to the side on me. There we go. Better. Lay that on top. Again, I tend to turn the hook shank toward me so I have the best possible view of what I'm binding down. And I'm going to bind this down fairly tightly. Again, this, oops, come on, stay where I put you. Now when I come back a little further, I'll be a little softer with the turns so that bucktail sits down a little bit more, and then nice and tight going forward. And that will bind everything down. So again, I'm trying to keep that slim profile. Then above that, I have a darker, very bluish gray. It looks a little bit too blue in that picture, but it's definitely a bluish gray bucktail. Again, I want it fairly flat, so I'm going to take it from the tip, or near the tip. And my phone is ringing, but I'm going to let it ring because I think I know who's calling. And I will call him back right after. Again, I'll lay this on top just to get that little bit of counter shading. Trim the butts. Lay it on top. Bind that down. And once it's bound down, clean up the head. Keep this as smooth as I can. So we have a nice streamlined shape. Move that back into the view a little better. And that, I'm going to need to do a little work with that pheasant crest. It has a tendency to meander. There we go. Now the cheeks on this, the cheeks on this are made from, I'm going to have to peek at that. Excuse me 1 second. Never mind. They gave up. Okay, good. Are teal flank feathers. I particularly like these because they look much more like what ought to be the cheek or the shoulder. So I'm going to strip off the fuzz at the base, as you would for anything else. And then I'm going to lay it on the far side first. And get it to the length I want, which is about 1/3 of the body length. And bind over that so it sits where I want it to. Then I'll do the same for the other side, which I will then rotate so I can see it. I'll strip all the fuzz off. Lay it in to be the same length as the other, which means I need to strip just a little bit more off. And once I'm happy with those, then I can come back in, snip the butts, snip those tag ends off, and then clean up the fly. So clean up the head with wraps just so that the whole head is uniformly black. Turn it to look at the other side and make sure there's nothing on the other side that would mess that up. And then we're ready to whip finish. Two rounds of 5 should do us perfectly well. Snip the thread. Then finish the head. I'm using Sally Hansen Hard as Nails. And I'll put one coat now. After that dries, I'll come back and do at least one more just to get a nice smooth shiny head. But one will secure it. It's perfectly fine for fishing with just one. I just like them. The way they look a little better if you get that extra layer on there. And that is a gray bucktail ghost. Nice for landlocked salmon. Brook trout take them. Lake trout take them. Very useful fly. Thank you very much. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to post them down below. I'd appreciate it if people would subscribe. I'm getting a few now. And have a good day. Thank you.